Hello. Today for the second Michigan AI Spotlight, I am talking to Trenton Chang. Trenton is a rising second year PhD student from the MLD3 lab advised by Jenna Weens. Before that, he earned his master's degree in computer science at Stanford, where he worked on robustness in video machine learning and conversational AI. But nowadays, he's working on recognizing and mitigating mechanisms for potential sources of bias in machine learning for healthcare. His new paper, Disparate Censorship, a mechanism for model performance gaps in clinical machine learning, is appearing at Machine Learning for Healthcare, or MLHC 2022 in August. So, hi, Trenton. Thanks again for joining us. And could you just tell me a little bit more about your research and what you do as a PhD student in the AI lab? Sort of what's your spiel on your work?
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much for having me. So, more broadly, our lab works in machine learning for healthcare. Specifically, I'm interested in fairness and equity in machine learning. That is, when we actually deploy and use machine learning models in practice in the hospital, how can we make sure that they don't replicate pre-existing biases in the healthcare system, or how do I make sure that we can proactively look for potential pitfalls and address this type of harm before it even happens.
Yeah, that's super important when we start bringing AI systems into settings where they can affect real people, right?
Mhm.
And I also had one naive question about AI in healthcare because it's not really my wheelhouse, and maybe some other people who aren't familiar would have this question. Where is AI actually currently being used in healthcare?
Sure, yeah. So there's a ton of applications. I can only speak to the ones that I'm most familiar with, but I know there's been work in building diagnostic models from radiology reports, such as X-rays, stuff like that. We have some work on that. The types of models that I've looked at the most are risk stratification models. Essentially, you want to predict the risk that a patient will develop at some later point during their hospital stay, certain infections, for example, C. diff or MRSA, two very common, very severe hospital-acquired infections. Yeah, so
Hmm.
essentially, these models can help. These models are intended to assist and team up with clinicians in making treatment decisions for various patients.
Right, right. And that's an important point that, AI in healthcare, when AI is getting involved in healthcare, it doesn't mean that it's taking over healthcare, but it's actually collaborating with your
Mhm.
physicians and your healthcare providers to actually improve their performance, right?
Yeah.
Um, right, right. Yeah, and then I guess given I think you're kind of at the forefront, especially along this line of mitigating bias in AI for healthcare.
Mhm.
Where do you think this field is going? I mean, what can we expect in the future? I guess, do you have any ideas about that?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Given that I've been only doing this for like a year or two, I don't want to speculate too much. What I would hope is that we have systems that can assist clinicians make in like making decisions and actually improve on their abilities instead of just shadowing them, and hopefully catch issues that otherwise our current clinical workflow might not have caught. I know that's
Mhm.
very vague, so maybe some examples could be like improved infection prediction, or just increasing the rate at which we catch things. I guess I tend to focus more on like the equity questions, so I haven't devoted as much thought about thinking about like specific applications.
I already mentioned that you have a paper coming out in MLHC 2022. What is that about? What did you look at in that paper?
Sure. So let me just briefly describe the premise. So, in the hospital setting, in the clinical setting, disparities in the rates at which laboratory or diagnostic tests are administered to patient populations have been well documented. For example, racial disparities in colon cancer screenings, or disparities across men and women in certain cardiac tests, especially for diagnosing things like heart attacks. Um, so the issue here is that not only are testing disparities an issue, but sometimes, but when we use machine learning models try and predict the risk of certain conditions based on these testing results. If the rates at which tests are ordered varies across patient subgroups, then you're going to have, I guess, different levels of label quality across these groups, right? In one group, you might have very reliable labels, but in another group of patients, you might have pretty unreliable labels, and that can cause your machine learning model to further underestimate the risk of patients who already were less likely to receive a test. That means that in practice, when you deploy a machine learning model in this setting with differential testing and such, um, you could just end up reinforcing decisions not to test patients who are already less likely to be tested, and thereby create a sort of feedback loop where you continually undertest certain patient populations. My work is in characterizing when these patterns of what types of testing patterns are actually most harmful to machine learning models. So we conduct a simulation study simulating some hypothetical condition and hypothetical clinician decisions, and we train a bunch of machine learning models in this simulation to determine conditions in which large performance gaps in model performance across the two groups arise.
That's super interesting. Sounds like a very hard problem, but also super important. We don't want machine learning models to come in and really help perpetuate some of the existing inequities and bias in healthcare. Now, another thing I was really curious to talk to you about was actually you told me your undergraduate degree was in American Studies,
Mhm.
if that's correct.
That's right.
I'm actually really curious, how did you go from humanities to like such a STEM intensive field? How did you discover AI and find your way here?
Sure. Yeah, and just for background, let me explain what American Studies is, because when I've had these
Sure.
conversations, I find that it's not the most common major people have heard of. So, um,
Hmm.
at risk of being really generic, it's a pretty interdisciplinary field that crosses a bunch of humanities disciplines such as history, literature, political science, and things like that. So it can be whatever you make it. For me personally, I wanted to look at ethnic studies, so I ended up doing a lot of work in Asian American history and just Asian American issues in general, and that taught me a lot about race relations in the U.S. and just the various social issues. Now, where this fits in with computer science. Initially, I just wanted to pick this up as a skill, but I ended up liking so much that I just started taking more and more courses, and I just kind of forgot to stop taking courses. That eventually led me to a bunch of AI and machine learning coursework, which I also completed and enjoyed very much. From which I was able to enter the master's program at Stanford. And keep doing what I do, keep doing something that I really enjoyed. Now, at some point, I realized that there were a lot of I became aware of a lot of these issues around equity and fairness in machine learning, and that's where I realized some of my experience studying these issues from the humanities perspective from more psychological perspective might be able to come in handy. I think that I, I think that my experience in American studies has definitely inspired my interest in machine learning fairness right now. It's definitely um, made me think about how I can use the principles about the social justice principles from the perspective of that field and apply that to machine learning. Like, how does this change how we optimize our models? How does this change the types of questions that we think about?
One could imagine like if you're going to make such a seemingly significant change in your career path, it's like did you just drop your old field of study and start something new? But in fact it was your old field of study that led you into where you are now, which is super cool. So that's awesome that you were able to find like your niche, exactly what you wanted to work on. um, was there anything that was like particularly challenging from jumping from humanities to AI?
I don't know if there's like anything particular that's harder to grasp, but I think a lot of it is internal because like if you're jumping from a humanities field into a pretty intensive STEM field, it can be really easy. Like it gives you a literal reason for feeling imposter syndrome, if that makes sense. So
Yeah.
of course I came from this other field, so why would I feel like I can do what I do here, right? So there's that. So I think most the most difficult part is just building the self-confidence that like despite like or no matter what background that you come from, it is possible for you to succeed in this field. And it's important to just compare yourself to yourself and not the all the other people that have been studying this since they were kids or anything like that. And that's been helpful.
Right, right, for sure. I can definitely relate to that to some degree because I came from primarily a mathematics background, which is maybe has some intersection with machine learning, but I don't know about you, but I don't really use that much math in my day-to-day work. Definitely agree with what you say about compare yourself to yourself, right?
Mhm.
There's always going to be another very smart person in the room, and you have to remember that we all bring, unique perspectives to our research, and we all earned our place here. Um, so definitely all good advice, I would say. Do you have any other advice for, someone who's in a distant field who's interested in AI research?
Mhm.
If they want to make a similar leap, what do they have to do to get where you're at? Especially nowadays where this field is very competitive and like hard to get into.
Yeah, sure. I think one important thing that, similar to what we've just gone over, is to just keep believing in yourself. This is obviously easier said than done, and I had it easier than a lot of other people going to a school that was very well resourced and very specifically very well equipped to bring people from like the beginner Hello World level to people that felt very comfortable coding. So that's
Hmm.
certainly an important resource. But I also think like everyone does bring their unique perspective to this field, and by having that experience outside of STEM, that's also given me like a different perspective on how I and on like the types of problems that we care about, and I think we need people that care about a variety of problems, right? And this
Hmm.
can yeah. More concretely, I did have to be pretty proactive as well in a lot of instances. I did a lot of teaching myself. I would, after class, I would go during school breaks, I would go off and do these fun projects on the side, not because I wanted to get into a PhD program eventually. I had no idea about that when I had just started out, but because I was just interested in it and I wanted to do something that I thought was fun. Um, th- I also needed to teach myself some of the mathematical concepts because I couldn't fit computer science and humanities and also a bunch of linear algebra courses in there. So there were times where I definitely needed to be proactive and like spend a bunch of extra time doing that. I was lucky to have that time to even be able to do that because I was supported throughout school on like scholarships, so I didn't have like a job that I needed to worry about.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, um, lots of stuff to be proactive about, but ultimately just like believing that I could do it and um, was just the most important thing.
Yeah, so it sounds like it takes some hard work to kind of make sure you are prepared, to do the work that you want to do, but it's doable, right?
Yeah,
Um,
and I think that actually doing it myself and like motivating myself also helped me appreciate this a lot.
mhm,
So because I wasn't doing it for class, I ended up developing like a sense of intrinsic motivation, and it taught me a lot about like how to work hard at a subject and like how to learn things just in general, which is useful beyond like a PhD program or learning even computer science in
mhm,
particular. I actually never really liked math very much until I had to teach it to myself and make myself like it. So
mhm. Yeah, that's awesome. Absolutely. And I'd say that probably becomes a pretty useful skill when you're working on research too, because a lot of when you're doing research, it's pretty self motivated, you're driving it, right? So
yes, yeah.
um, to keep yourself going when there's a lot of ambiguity, a lot of unknown. That's a super useful skill for a PhD and in general. Yeah, so that's awesome. And there was one other thing that when I was scouring your personal website, I was curious to hear about.
Great.
You worked on the Alexa Prize SocialBot Challenge with Stanford NLP.
Mhm.
Um, so I'm currently participating in the SimBot Challenge from them, which is basically rather than having some kind of social chat bot, you have some kind of embodied agent in a virtual
Yeah.
environment that's following some human language instructions. So how did the SocialBot Challenge go for you? What advice do you have for me?
Yeah, it was really fun. So what I was in charge of for our group was I trained a bunch of large language models, or like more specifically, I fine-tuned and distilled a bunch of them so that we could serve high quality language models in production without making the user wait like 30 seconds for all our GPUs to give like the
Hmm.
conversation. It was sort of used as like filler or for like handling subjects for which we didn't have more explicit structured like a structured conversational pattern for it. So I think the biggest challenge was just dealing with dealing with data, essentially.
Hmm.
You learn a lot about how data is messy in like machine learning courses, but it's another thing to experience it yourself and just see like the raw flow of like speech recognition transcribed data and figuring out what to do with it. How do I even evaluate a conversational model on this? Was one of the biggest challenges for me. I think our group had like a very nice system of just like organizing all the conversations and being able to like read through all the conversations basically as if it was like a text message and seeing like what part of a system was responsible for that. So I grew
Hmm.
to like really appreciate like good like logging tools and like good bookkeeping tools for the conversations that our bot had. Yeah. Is the
Hmm. Hmm.
biggest delta in making it even possible for me to work on anything. So,
Yeah, yeah, that's all yeah, really good for me to keep in mind.
mhm.
What would be your biggest advice in general for incoming or prospective grad students? What is your big lesson that you keep with you?
Ooh, okay. As a rising second year, I'm pretty new to this, but I think if I can just say like the things that helped me get through my first year personally. I think just one, remembering that you are here for a reason, that like someone who like your advisor, someone who you probably look up to wants you to be here. And
Hmm.
that's important to remember. The other thing is to somewhat paradoxically like appreciating like the importance of taking breaks. We are all here because we work very hard and we care a lot about like the problems that we try to do. So I think like the a lot of my peers like the reason we're here is because of how much we've worked in the past. But like now without any bounds or structure, it's also important to remember to take breaks. One thing that I saw that I really liked was that taking breaks is important because if you don't listen to your body and take breaks when you need to, your body will take a break for you, and you probably won't like it when that happens. So
Hmm.
I think that's important to remember, and like just resting up also lets you recharge and do the type of work that we care about.
Right, right. Yeah, burnout is real, and you need to make sure you don't get there. So be kind to yourself, be kind to your body and your mind, um,
Mhm.
and yeah, take breaks when you need to. So are you at a phase where you're gearing up for your prelim, or have you already finished it?
Unclear. Um, depending on depending on things, I'd either take it in the fall or in the winter. Yeah.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Hmm.
I would be
Yeah.
talking
So.
about my paper for sure, and I'm hoping to over the summer to develop like a even more robust set of results and like an even more comprehensive perspective on this problem. Because right now we've sort of characterized the problem space and like we staked a claim to like this territory, but like actually figuring out, all right, we know that there are testing disparities, and these are the conditions that cause problems for machine learning models. What do we do about it, and how do we, as like someone working in a hospital developing a machine learning model, how do I know when I need to be careful, stuff like that.
Hmm.
Yeah.
hmm Right, right. So you've introduced the problem. Now you kind of want to do some work on solving the problem, towards solving the problem.
Yeah.
Um,
Mhm.
your advice is going to come in handy as you get closer to the prelim, I would say. So make sure you are kind to yourself as you get there. It's
Mhm.
for me, it was probably the hardest milestone so far in the PhD.
Mhm.
Maybe one of the hardest things I've ever done, possibly. Definitely be kind to yourself, take breaks. And I think since you already have a paper out, you're in very good shape. I think you already have a lot to talk about. Good luck on
Thanks.
that.
Yeah, thank you.
To wrap up, I can remind anyone who might be watching that Trenton has a paper coming out in MLHC 2022 in August called Disparate Censorship, a Mechanism for Model Performance Gaps in Clinical Machine Learning. So look out for that.
This was great. Thanks so much for chatting with me today.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you.